Hey, welcome back for another lecture in the human species. Today we're going to talk about what's called the demographic transition and aging. Again, I just want to reiterate that the third and final lab report, is due on Tuesday, which is July 14th, and the final exam for the course is scheduled for Thursday, July 16th, which is 1 week from today. The study guide for the exam was posted on Blackboard some time ago, and as I've mentioned previously, I think it's a good idea to start studying as soon as you can. Remember that the final will include information or questions that cover the material from the entirety of the course, although it will be focused more on material from the last 1/3 of the course since the previous exam. Okay, so today we're going to ask a question, which is, how does individual reproductive behavior affect population growth, in particular in humans? So the demographic transition is the transition from a high birth and death rate to lower birth and death rates as a country or a region develops from like an agricultural or pre-industrial society to an industrialized economic system. The theory was proposed in 1929 by the American demographer Warren Thompson. And so we can divide up the demographic transition into 4 different stages. And so in stage 1, it's characterized, the country or the region of interest, the population is characterized by high birth and death rates. And so in this image, the death rate is red and the birth rate is blue. And so stage 1 involves high birth and death rates and a low population size. In stage 2, the population experiences a lower death rate. And so as a result, the population size increases. In stage 3, the population experiences a lower birth rate, and the population increase begins to sort of taper off or level off. And then finally, in stage 4, the low in birth death rate results in a large population. And so this is the demographic transition. Here's some empirical data from Sweden from the period 1735 to the year 2000. And so here the birth rate begins to drop around 1850, which is way before effective birth control. And so in different populations around the world, we tend to see this pattern of dropping death rates and birth rates, essentially just related to shifts in culture and society related to industrialization. Here's another example of a demographic transition in Mexico. So this is a comparison of Sweden versus Mexico. And so you can see here that there is a kind of analogous shift or a change in the death rate and birth rate in Mexico in the latter part of this time interval. You'll notice, however, that there's a big increase in the death rate here in the Mexican population that's related to the Mexican Revolution that spanned a period from about 1910 to 1920, where an estimated 1.7 to 2.7 million people died. But even despite that shift in the death rate, that kind of anomalous shift in the death rate, this Mexican population still experienced a decrease over time in birth and death rates. And so other populations around the world are going through this demographic transition as well, particularly as life expectancy increases. And so here is an example of demographic transitions, some data from 5 different countries going through demographic transitions. And so, like stochastic factors, like random factors, historical factors, political and social factors, all will influence the timing and pattern of the demographic transition in different populations around the world. Okay, so really there's 2 main factors that explain the demographic transition. And so, or at least we can say the birth and death rates, the annual birth and death rates of populations are primarily determined by 2 factors. And those 2 factors are mortality and levels of fertility experienced by individuals. And so let's start by talking about mortality. Mortality is often measured by what's called the life expectancy at birth. And so this plot shows life expectancy data in different populations through time. Life expectancy at birth equals the average number of years a newborn would live if subjected to age-specific mortality rates observed in a given year. And so basically what we see over time in different populations around the world is a kind of parallel increase in life expectancy. The more southern countries experienced exceptional improvements in life expectancy from an average of about 40 to 41 years in the early 1950s to about 64 years in the early 2000s. By the early 2000s, Latin America reached life expectancy levels similar to those in the North in the 1970s. In this case, Africa experienced the highest mortality and improvements in life expectancy stalled, however, in the 1990s due to the AIDS epidemic. Okay. So projections of, like statistical projections of future life expectancies by the UN assume continued improvements over time in all of these regions. And so the northern regions are expected to reach a life expectancy of around 82 years in the year 2050, despite increasing difficulties in achieving increments or, like progressive improvements as countries sort of reach their max life expectancy. Okay, so that's one of the factors that explains patterns of birth rates and death rates, life expectancy or mortality. The other factor that plays a role in determining those birth and death rates is total fertility rate, or TFR. And so the total fertility rate equals the number of births a woman would have by the end of her reproductive years if she experienced the so-called age-specific fertility rates prevailing in a given year. So you can think of it as just the number of kids a woman has, basically, over the course of her reproductive years. And so this figure shows data on the total fertility rate in different regions around the world through time. And so the high total fertility rate in the earlier years reflects an absence of birth control. In the 1960s, we observe a fairly rapid decline in total fertility rate related to a couple of factors, or probably related to a couple of factors. And so this decline we're referring to is this sort of parallel decrease in total fertility rate in the number of births that a woman would have throughout her reproductive years. And so the first one is that as the cost of raising a kid increases and as child survival increases, parents may want smaller families. So it could reflect a personal choice that reflects a change surrounding the economics of raising kids and the fact that children are surviving to older ages. The second component are different forms of government interventions in different populations around the world. And so, for example, in China, at some point, a one-child policy was instituted, which decreased the total fertility rate. Other forms of government intervention in different populations or governments around the world include, like providing access to things like family planning and birth control. If you look at this plot, the total fertility rate, you'll see that there's this horizontal line here. And that horizontal line reflects 2 births per woman, which is the estimated replacement level. And basically the replacement level is just the level at which each generation just replaces the previous one. And so if the total fertility rate reaches 2 in a given population, in the absence of like a change in mortality or a change in migration, population growth will be 0. So anything above 2 will lead to population growth. Anything below 2 will lead to population decline. Okay. So those are the 2 factors that explain variation in birth rates and death rates. Mortality, which we measure as life expectancy, and fertility, which we measure as the total fertility rate. And so here's some more data showing that the total fertility rate has been falling in different populations around the world since the 1950s. And so basically the total fertility rate went somewhere between like 6 or 7 in the 1960s to about 2 or less today. And so again, total fertility rate of 6 means that a woman would have 6 children, 6 surviving children in her life. And so in the U.S., in 2010, the total fertility rate was 1.9. And so how can you have 0.9 kids? Well, keep in mind that this is an average, right? So some individuals would have 2 kids, some individuals would have 1, some individuals would have 0, some individuals would have 3, right? And so the average is 1.9, but we can, just for the sake of simplicity, we can just say it's 2. And so as we mentioned, this decline in the fertility rate over time in different populations could be a cultural phenomenon. Perhaps the parents feel the need to invest more in each child, and over time, societal norms change. And so that's one possibility. A second possibility, which is not mutually exclusive, it could be a thing that explains this pattern simultaneously, is that it's a biological phenomenon that actually potentially matches predictions from life history theory that we discussed in the previous lecture. So remember that in life history theory, there are a number of different trade-offs that we observe in different species. And so one of those important trade-offs is the one between reproduction and maintenance investment. In particular, the energy that an individual or a species spends on reproduction versus maintenance. And when we say maintenance, what we mean is the energy required just to survive as an adult individual. And the important thing to remember is that energy, which is a critical resource for life, is a finite resource. Right? There's not an infinite amount of energy available to individuals within species. And so individuals and species therefore need to budget the energy available to them for different things. And so reproduction is one of those things, and maintenance is another thing. And so if an individual or a species spends energy on reproduction, it's not available for maintenance. And so diverting more energy to reproduction typically means that that species or that individual will have a shorter lifespan. And so here's one example that we mentioned before in a bird species called Paris major, which looks at the relationship between the percent of parents surviving and the number of offspring. And what this data show is that as the number of offspring increase, or we can think of it as the energy allocated to reproduction increases, parental survival decreases. And that's, again, because the energy spent on reproduction isn't available for maintenance, isn't available for survival. We mentioned before that in this species, there's no effect of the number of offspring on parental survival in males. And so why not? Well, that's because the males of this species don't invest nearly as much energy into offspring as the females do. And so again, that's that difference between males and females is, I think, clear evidence that this is really an energy issue. Okay, so here's another example of the trade-off between reproduction and maintenance. So this plot shows body weight on the y-axis and the number of chicks on the x-axis. And so essentially what this shows is that the mortality rate is higher for birds with lower body weight. Mortality rate is higher for birds with lower body weight, supporting this link between reproduction, or this link as a trade-off between reproduction and maintenance. Here's another bird example. This shows on the y-axis female weight change and brood size on the x-axis. This plot shows female survival on the y-axis and the number of chicks on the x-axis. And so again, we find strong evidence of this trade-off, this life history trade-off in different species. Essentially, the more energy a female individual puts into reproduction, the less energy is available for maintaining its own survival. Okay, so we can tie in this life history pattern or this life history trend into lifespan. And so this plot shows lifespan on the y-axis and body mass or body size on the x-axis. And we saw previously that primates in general, compared to most other mammals, and especially apes, tend to die old, right? They live a long time given their body size. Whereas many other mammals tend to die young, so to speak, right? They die earlier, they have a shorter lifespan than would be predicted given their body size. And so humans are a bit of an outlier among the apes. And that's because humans have exceptionally long lives. And so here is a comparison of maximum lifespan in years against body mass or body size. And humans fall about here. And so humans live a really long time, about twice as long as other apes. And so researchers are studying the phenomenon of aging in humans, right? Why do humans live such long lives? What are the factors, be they genetic or environmental, that contribute to long lifespan in humans? And so there's one long-term study. There's multiple long-term studies, but this is one of them, the New England Centenarian Study. And a centenarian is just a person who is 100 years old or older. And so basically this study is looking at families that include individuals that live to a very, very old age to try to identify the factors that predict aging or predict aging well. And so I'd look it up if you have interest. Look it up online. They have a website devoted to it. It's really an interesting study. And one of the things that they've uncovered is that there's a strong genetic component to living a long life, to having a long lifespan. Another thing that they found is that they found many relevant things here, but of interest to us is that the majority of individuals who live to be 100 or more tend to be women. And so women have a much longer lifespan than males in different human populations around the world. And so interestingly enough, another one of the results is that many of these individuals who live to a very old age have a history of having children a little bit later in life, right? Having children after the age of 35 and maybe even 40 years. And so I think they found something like a woman who naturally has a child after the age of 40 has something like a 4 times greater chance of living to be 100 years old compared to women who don't. And so according to the researchers who focus on this area, it's not that having a kid in your 40s gives you a long life. It's not that, like, if you have a kid in your 40s, it's going to cause you to live to 100 years old. But instead could simply indicate that that woman's reproductive system is aging more slowly, and that the rest of the body is as well. And so that potential slow aging, and the avoidance or delay of diseases that influence reproduction, would basically increase that woman's chance or ability to live to a very old age. So in humans, there's just like natural variation in lifespan. Okay. So humans live to be very old. Humans live to be about twice as old as apes do. But one of the interesting things about humans is that for women, there is a very long post-reproductive life. And so we saw this plot last time. Essentially, most of the non-human primates die shortly after their reproductive life ends. Whereas in humans, that's not the case. At some point, the reproductive period ends, and individuals go through a period of menopause, and they enter a post-reproductive period. And so we see this pattern or this trend in different human populations around the world, this pattern or trend of having a long post-reproductive life. And so we could ask, is this an evolved trait? Could it be due to the environment alone? And to sort of expand it out, how does aging happen generally? So we could sort of reframe the question and ask, why don't we just live forever? And so here's an example of the bristlecone pine that has a lifespan of something like 5,000 years old. Right? So why don't we just live to be 5,000 years old? Well, one theory of aging is called the disposable soma theory of aging. And so the idea is that, senescence, which is just the process of deterioration with age, is not necessarily inevitable, but that maintaining your life and your body and your physiology requires energy. And so, as I mentioned, senescence is just age-related decline in function. And the idea here is that species evolve to balance out the energy spent on maintenance and reproduction. And so this balance effectively determines lifespan. And so, again, it's not that like senescence or deterioration with age is an inevitability of life, but maintaining is just it's too energetically costly. Maintaining a very long lifespan, in other words, would potentially limit the energy that's available for reproduction. And by limiting energy for reproduction, it negatively influences evolutionary fitness. And so, yeah, you can live to a very old age, potentially. A species could, potentially. But they wouldn't be able to have as many offspring or any offspring at all. And so that, in that context, we wouldn't expect those traits to evolve, right? We would expect traits to evolve that maximize fitness. Okay. So like many of the things that we've talked about in this course, aging is a complex trait. It's not a simple Mendelian trait. It's not like one individual has the gene to live to be 100 and the other individual doesn't. What do we mean by a complex trait, though? Think back to the earlier part of the course. What does that actually mean? Well, by a complex trait, we mean that there's an environmental interaction with the genotype that influences the phenotype. So remember that genotype refers to the underlying genetics, right? The genes that code for a particular phenotype. And the environment refers to any sort of condition that influences the expression of those genetics. And so here is this familiar case that we've shown before, where we have 3 different genes. And each of these genes has a different number of alleles or alleles. Remember that alleles are just variants of a gene. And so gene 1 has 3 alleles, gene 2 has 2 alleles, and gene 3 has 4 alleles. 4 different versions. Oh, okay, so remember that each individual inherits half of their genome from their mom and half of their genome from their dad. And so at any particular locus, we have one of two. We have one copy from mom and one copy from dad. And so given these alleles associated with each gene, there are multiple different genotype combinations available for each gene. And when combining these different genotypes with different environments, we have the ability to produce numerous different phenotypes, even though the underlying alleles are shared, even though the underlying alleles are very similar. Right? So we've only got, 9 different alleles, right? 3 plus 2 is 5, plus 4 is 9. 9 different alleles in this hypothetical example could lead to 540 possible phenotypes. And so aging is one of these traits. It's a complex trait that's influenced by the environment. And so when we say environment, the environment is sort of like a very broad term. It encapsulates many different environments through space and time. The environment could be like the prenatal environment, right? Like as each of us was developing, as an embryo, we were influenced by the things that our biological mothers did, right? How much they exercise, did they smoke, did they drink alcohol while pregnant, right? That's an example of the environment. The environment can also be the things that one is exposed to after birth and throughout growth and development. What kind of childhood did we each have? Did we eat our fruits and vegetables? Did we smoke and drink at a young age? The environment can also be the adult environment after maturation. And so aging is influenced by a multitude of environmental factors in combination with genes. And so through things like twin studies, studying biological twins, identical twins that have identical genetics, that's one way to sort of look at the environmental effects that contribute to phenotypes, including things like aging and deterioration. And so one of the things that's emerged from studies of relatives and families is that if you have a sibling live to be 100 years old, it increases your chances of living to be 100 years old by something like 5 to 10 times. And so here's an example of identical twins, and they're called identical twins because their genetics are identical. They have the exact same genetics that they inherited from their biological mother and father. And so one individual is a smoker and spent more time in the sun, whereas another individual was a non-smoker and spent less time in the sun. And so because of those differences in their environment, they're going to develop differently. Even though they look very similar, one individual is going to age more heavily and at a higher rate than the other. And so this is one of the reasons why it's important to take care of ourselves, right? To try to limit the consumption of the bad things, even though many of us may not be perfect all of the time, right? Like we probably shouldn't be eating lots of sugar, even though like we all enjoy an occasional dessert, right? It's probably not a good idea to drink excessive alcohol, even though, once you're 21, it's kind of a fun experience to socialize and have a beer. But so it's important to keep these things in mind. Okay, so here's a comparison of female life expectancy to male life expectancy in different populations around the world. And so the black line here means that life expectancy life expectancy for men equals life expectancy for women. And so if populations fell along this line, it would mean that life expectancy was the same for both sexes. And the thing that we observe is that for the most part, across most of these populations, women have a greater life expectancy than men. And so this could be due to both genetic and environmental factors. One of the things I've found interesting about the study on centenarians is that individuals who live to a very old age tend to be very good at coping with stress for whatever reason. Right? That could be a genetic reason, it could be an environmental or behavioral reason, but they tended to deal well with stress. And we know that stress, like psychosocial stress, can have a physical manifestation, right? Like raising cortisol and taxing the physiology of humans. So again, aging is a complex trait. One of the things that's been observed is that life expectancy is strongly correlated with GDP per capita, or wealth, gross domestic product per capita. Per capita just means it's standardized by population size, basically. And so what we see is that life expectancy has this sort of exponential relationship with GDP, but past a certain point, it kind of evens out. The curve kind of flattens. And with increasing wealth, there's not as much of a dramatic increase in life expectancy. And so you might wonder, like, why is life expectancy correlated with GDP? Well, it's related to things like access to higher quality medical care, as well as like higher quality hygiene. This is a guy called Dr. Spaceman from the TV show 30 Rock. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend that you check it out. One of the best like TV comedies ever made. Okay. So the thing is, as I just mentioned, as GDP increases more and more and more, life expectancy kind of flatlines, right? In other words, it's not a linear relationship where as GDP increases, life expectancy increases more and more and more and more. It increases dramatically, and past a certain point, it flattens out. So that pattern could imply that although there's a strong environmental component to aging, that genetics sort of caps, it constrains the ability of humans to live far past, far past this point, to ages of like 100 or more. And so there's really interesting research, some really interesting data that's been suggested to provide evidence for a limit or a constraint on human lifespan. And so this is from a study published in Nature in 2016. And this image shows the maximum age at death on the y-axis over time. And one of the things that we see is that there's an increase in maximum age at death, right? Lifespan is increasing. And then eventually, sometime in the mid to late 90s, early 2000s, lifespan stops increasing. And so there's very little change in life expectancy for those over 100 since the year 1900. And so these data imply that 100 and just over 100 years of age might be a kind of ceiling for humans, an aging ceiling for humans. Okay, so what are the factors that actually lead to aging on a physiological and biological level? Well, there's all kinds of studies that have been conducted in different animal groups looking at how many calories individuals consume over time. And one of the results that's emerged over and over again from these studies is that calorie restriction increases survival and lifespan. Right? So eating as much as you want and not restricting calories contributes to an earlier death. And this is not just in humans, this is in macaques, as in this study, this is in other animals. And so basically the control groups or the groups that are allowed to consume as many calories as they want experience increased risk of disease. Right? Things like cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and so on. And so calorie restriction, it turns out, is probably a good thing. Right? It's probably not good to be in a calorie surplus all the time. Okay, well, but what about on a cellular level? Okay. So humans and many other animals as eukaryotic organisms have a cell. We are multicellular organisms. We have a cell that contain that each contain organelles that carry out different functions. And so our cells contain mitochondria, right? You've probably seen the meme, right? The mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. They produce energy for the cell, which is something called ATP, right? Or adenosine triphosphate. And as a natural product of the production of energy at the cellular level are these things called reactive oxygen species, or ROS. These are just natural byproducts of the normal metabolism of oxygen, which is related to the production of ATP. And so most ROS are neutralized by antioxidants. However, any ROS that escapes can cause damage and can contribute to things like heart disease, Alzheimer's, cancer, and bad things of that nature. And so here again, we have a link between energy and aging. And so this is kind of like the most proximate mechanism at the cellular level. Okay, so when and how did the long lifespan of humans evolve? And so here's an image of a man from a group called the Hadza, which are a more traditional human group And this man is in his late 60s. And many individuals of this Hadza population live to be active in their 70s and 80s, right? They live to be fit and healthy. And that's probably related to the fact that this population experiences a high degree of physical activity. And so here's some data looking at daily walking distance, which is kilometers per day. 1 kilometer is equivalent to just over half a mile. So 0.6 miles is 1 kilometer. And so the blue dots are men and the yellow dots are women. And so at a max, we see that the daily kilometers per day is like 15 or 16 observed here, and a minimum for, relatively younger individuals is about 4 or 5 kilometers per day. But even through aging into the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, individuals are still walking multiple kilometers per day. And so physical activity and calorie restriction are probably the things that contribute to living living to be an old individual. So we know that there's an environmental component, like the things we do, the stuff we put into our bodies. There's also a genetic component, right? Some individuals have the genetics to allow them to live to be 100 or older. Other individuals don't have those genetic variants. The environmental component is probably related to things like we've just mentioned, like physical activity and diet, but also to things like hygiene and medicine. However, from the fossil record, from the studies of the teeth and jaws and skulls of ancient human ancestors like Neanderthals and early modern humans, it's been suggested that those species, those archaic species, have been living into old age for a very long time, right? For at least 100,000 years. And so this image shows the percent of adults in a population between certain ages, right? Between 20 to 40 years old in blue here. And and older than 40 years old here. And so a small percent of individuals among Neanderthals and early modern humans live to be greater than 40 years old, right? So it's not only that we have modern medicine, it's probably an evolved part of who we are as a species that we can then enhance through modern medicine, through better hygiene, through exercise, through calorie restriction and diet, and so on. Okay. So again, humans have this long lifespan that's dramatically longer than we see in our ape relatives. And in particular, women have a very long post-reproductive life. And so this is fairly rare in other animals. And so what might be the evolutionary cost of a long post-reproductive lifespan? Think about the disposable soma theory. In other words, a longer life means that energy is diverted from reproduction. It's channeled away from reproduction. And so how could that be beneficial if you aren't reproducing during your later life? Well, one hypothesis is the grandmother hypothesis, that childcare and and what's called alloparenting is so critical for humans that stopping reproduction earlier in life, earlier than necessary, to help raise your grandchildren is favored by natural selection. Remember that through inclusive fitness, a grandmother still shares genetics with grandchildren. And so by helping raise grandchildren, grandmothers and relatives can increase their own evolutionary fitness because their grandkids inherited their DNA, right, through the intermediaries, right, through the biological mother or father. So that's one hypothesis. That's a particularly compelling hypothesis. Another hypothesis is, which is not mutually exclusive with this, is one of constraint. Right? In other words, the way our bodies are built, there's no way to make the female reproductive system last longer. It's just a natural kind of byproduct of our biology and physiology. Okay, the third hypothesis is that there could also be selection for long lives in men, because men can reproduce into their later years. Men don't go through the same kind of menopause or amenopause at all. And in this case, the lifespan of women could be brought along with that selection for long lives in men. So in other words, I'll try to rephrase this. If men can reproduce from basically the time of puberty into old age, that means that their evolutionary fitness is influenced by how long they live, right? If they live longer, they can have more kids into older age. And so if there's selection for long lives in men, women's lifespan could be, would naturally be increased as well, given the shared genetics and development of all humans, right? So in other words, it would be like a kind of integrated or pleiotropic effect on the lifespan of women, even though women's lifespan was not necessarily a target of natural selection. Now, truthfully, explaining the long lifespan, and in particular the long post-reproductive lifespan of women, isn't necessarily reliant on any one hypothesis, right? It's probably all of these things combined. The combination of increasing evolutionary fitness through alloparenting by grandmothers, the fact that the reproductive system is just constrained, the way our bodies are built sort of limits the female reproductive system from lasting longer. And then finally, there could also be selection for long lives in men, where the lifespan of women is sort of brought along as a pleiotropic effect. And that's it. We have one more lecture left. It should be a relatively brief one. I'm going to try to do a kind of brief overview and recap of the course. But that's it. The course is almost over. As I mentioned before, I'd recommend studying now for the final exam. Please feel free to let me know if you have any questions about the lab or the exam moving forward. Talk to you guys next time.